Grace Walker never expected that a quiet prayer under the Christmas tree would lead to a miracle. But that night, a tiny sound broke the silence, a faint, desperate whimper from the snow. She looked down and gasped. Inside a small gift box lay the smallest newborn German shepherd she had ever seen, no bigger than her thumb, trembling, struggling just to breathe. Its tiny heartbeat fluttered weakly against her palm, begging for a chance to live. Grace rushed to the vet, heart pounding. Dr. Matthew Lewis stared in shock. He had never seen a puppy this small survive. "This shouldn't be possible," he whispered, tears in his eyes. "This is a miracle." "What do we do?" Grace asked. "We fight," he replied. "As long as he keeps fighting, we never give up." Grace held him tighter. She wasn't just saving a puppy. God had just placed a miracle in her hands. Winter snow drifted peacefully across Willow Springs beneath the glow of Christmas lights. The town was small, quiet, tucked among hills of Ohio where every winter felt like a page from an old storybook. Yet for many hearts, silence could feel heavier than snow. Among those hearts was Grace Walker, a 79-year-old widow with soft silver hair that curled lightly around her ears. Her back was slightly stooped from years of working as a seamstress, but her posture still carried a hint of grace, like a ballerina who refused to let time take away dignity. Her skin was lined with gentle creases, each one a memory of love and loss. Her husband, Thomas, had passed away 7 years earlier, and since then a quiet stillness had filled her small home. Her daughter lived on the West Coast with 2 children of her own, rarely able to visit. Grace understood. They all had their own lives, but that did not ease the loneliness that tiptoed behind her every night. Tonight, she stood alone in the town square, wrapped in a long wool coat in a shade of faded plum. She wore knitted gloves she had made herself decades ago, now stretched and softened by time. At the center of the square towered the town's pride, a massive Christmas tree adorned with shimmering lights, golden ribbons, and countless ornaments, some shaped like stars, others like tiny presents wrapped in metallic foil. The people of Willow Springs had decorated it that morning. Families had gathered laughing, children racing around, hot cocoa being spilled and forgiven instantly. Grace had smiled watching them, but from a distance. Tonight, everyone else had returned home for Christmas Eve dinner. She remained, seeking comfort in the lights when the world around her dimmed. Grace walked slowly to the base of the tree, leaning slightly on her cane, her breath rising in small white clouds. She pressed her gloved hands together, a gesture halfway between holding warmth and offering prayer. She murmured quietly, a voice too soft for even the swirling wind to catch. "Lord, if you hear me, I'm trying to stay strong, but nights get lonely. I don't need anything grand, just something, a reason to awake tomorrow." Her eyes lifted toward the glowing branches as though waiting for an answer. Nothing came but the gentle flicker of holiday bulbs. She tried to smile anyway. Christmas was a time for miracles, but only in children's books, she reminded herself. Just then, the wind shifted suddenly, whirling stronger, tugging at ornaments and ribbons. A faint rustling above her caused her to look up. One of the tiny gift-shaped boxes, no bigger than a teacup, shook free from a branch and tumbled downward. Grace stepped back with surprise as it bounced once on the snowy ground. Then the lid snapped open. Inside lay something so small she nearly overlooked it, a newborn German shepherd puppy. yet impossibly tiny, no larger than the tip of her thumb. Its fur was a deep gray-brown, sleek but wet from melting snow. Its eyes were squeezed shut, its sides quivering rapidly, as though every breath was a battle. Grace gasped, her heart leaping into her throat. "Oh, dear heavens!" She bent as quickly as her old knees allowed, lowering herself carefully. Her hands trembled as she reached toward the fragile creature. When her fingertips brushed its tiny body, she felt warmth, faint, flickering like the last ember in a dying fire. And then, so quietly she almost believed she imagined it, a tiny whimper, a plea. Grace's chest tightened. Her motherly instincts, long dormant yet never extinguished, surged awake like a fire rekindled. "Little one, what has happened to you?" she whispered, voice shaking. The puppy's tiny paws twitched, scraping weakly against the edge of the gift box. It was fighting to stay here, with her. Grace could feel tears rising. She hadn't expected to cry tonight, not in front of a tree, not in front of strangers who weren't there. But emotion broke through her loneliness like a beam of hopeful light. "You're alive," she murmured, a new urgency filling her tone. "You're alive and you need help." She pressed the puppy gently into her palm, its entire body curling into the center of her hand like a living ornament. The warmth of its heartbeat pulsed against her skin, rapid yet fragile. That heartbeat anchored her suddenly, grounding her more than any prayer had done in years. A gust of wind whipped at her coat, and she instinctively cupped her other hand over the tiny body, shielding it from the cold. "I've got you," she said, breath trembling. "I won't let you go, not now." Her mind raced. The veterinary clinic, Willow Springs Animal Care, would still be open. It always remained open on Christmas Eve, because the vet believed animals didn't schedule emergencies around holidays. Dr. Matthew Lewis, she remembered, a kind man in his early 40s, tall with a rugged jawline and dark beard always trimmed neatly. His brown eyes often carried warmth, though she'd seen hints of weariness there too, as though life had asked too much of him at times. Grace had no idea how a creature this small existed, much less survived, but she wouldn't waste another second asking questions when its life ticked on a thread. She stood slowly, every ache in her bones warning her to move carefully, but urgency overpowered pain. She tucked the tiny pup inside the inner pocket of her coat, directly over her heart. It fit there perfectly, as though the pocket had been waiting for it. With one final glance at the shimmering Christmas tree behind her, still sparkling proudly, unaware of the miracle it had dropped, Grace turned toward the snowy street leading to the clinic. Her cane pressed into the snow with determination she had not felt in years. The puppy's faint, warm presence against her chest was the only sign she needed. She had come to that tree, searching for a reason to keep going. Now, nestled in her coat, a reason breathed. And Grace took her first step into a night that would change everything. Snowflakes swirled through the air as Grace Walker hurried along the dim sidewalk, her cane tapping steadily against the icy pavement. Beneath her plum-colored coat, pressed close against her chest, the tiny German shepherd pup shivered, breathing in shallow, rapid bursts. Every few steps, Grace placed her palm lightly over the inner pocket to feel that delicate heartbeat. Still there, still fighting. She whispered encouragement into the cold air, her breath fogging around her face. "Hold on, little one. We're almost there. Just a bit further." Willow Springs. Animal Care stood at the corner of Maple and 3rd Street, its windows glowing a soft golden yellow. a beacon of hope in a world too often indifferent. The illuminated sign out front flickered slightly, as though the building itself was tired from years of midnight emergencies. As Grace neared the door, she caught sight of Dr. Matthew Lewis through the glass. He was a tall man in his early 40s, broad shoulders forming a silhouette against the warm light inside. Even from this distance, she could see the faint scruff along his jaw and the deep lines etched into his face, marks left not by age, but by responsibility. Years of caring for fragile creatures had given him eyes that saw every detail and a heart that absorbed too much. He was wiping down a metal exam table, his posture suggesting a long, exhausting shift. Pushing through the door, Grace called out with more urgency than she intended. "Dr. Lewis, please!" Her voice cracked. The jingle of the doorbell startled him. He glanced up, and concern immediately sharpened his features, dark brows drawing together over warm brown eyes. "Mrs. Walker?" he asked, instantly recognizing her. "Is something wrong?" Grace couldn't find the words quickly enough. Instead, she reached trembling hands toward her coat, carefully revealing the tiny pup curled in her palm. Dr. Lewis stepped closer, disbelief widening his eyes. "What on earth?" He gently cupped his hand beneath Grace's, helping to support the minuscule creature. The pup let out the slightest whimper, no louder than a sigh. Matthew's expression shifted, from confusion to alarm to awe in the span of a breath. "I've never seen a puppy this small," he murmured. "Certainly not a German shepherd. It must have been born only hours ago." His voice softened further when the pup twitched a paw, as if pleading for mercy. The sound drew the attention of a young woman wearing blue scrubs behind the reception desk. Julia Carter, the clinic's part-time assistant and a college freshman, hurried over. She was slender, barely 20, with a cascade of auburn hair tied into a messy ponytail, freckles dusting her nose like tiny constellations. Kind-hearted and easily moved, Julia had taken the night shift to save money for school, but she never complained. Helping animals made her feel useful in a world that often seemed too complicated. When Julia glanced down at the tiny life in Grace's hand, her lips parted, and her eyes quickly glossed with tears. "He's so tiny," she breathed. "How is he alive?" "Because he refuses not to be," Grace whispered, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. Matthew guided them into the nearest exam room. With remarkable care, he transferred the pup onto a folded towel he laid over the metal table. The creature's breathing was faint, but its chest rose. Miracle after miracle. He flicked on a heating lamp positioned above the table, casting a soft red glow across the pup's fur. Grace stood close, clutching her cane with one hand while the other hovered protectively over the table. Every second in which the puppy struggled for air felt like an eternity stretching thin. "Did you find him outside?" Matthew asked, glancing up as he checked the pup's pulse with the gentlest touch of his stethoscope. "Under the Christmas tree," Grace answered, "inside a little gift box, as if he fell from the branches." She said it quietly, almost questioning her own story. Matthew paused, brow knitting. "A gift box?" His tone carried concern now, uncertainty. Grace nodded. "Do you think someone—" Her voice faltered. "Could any human intentionally leave such a tiny life to freeze?" Matthew didn't finish the thought. He simply shook his head as if pushing away the darker possibilities. As he continued, his gentle demeanor revealed something Grace had always admired from afar. He wasn't just a veterinarian. He was a guardian for every creature too small to be heard. The pup whimpered again, tiny legs kicking weakly. Julia leaned closer, hands clasped tightly near her chest to keep them from shaking. "Come on, little guy," she whispered. "Stay with us." Grace felt a sudden sting behind her eyes. She didn't know this puppy, not really, yet watching him fight stirred something deep inside her, something she hadn't felt since holding her newborn daughter in a hospital room decades ago. She remembered the fear then, the fragile uncertainty of life beginning. It was the same fear now, only magnified by the pup's impossibly small size. "He has a strong heart," Matthew said quietly, though his eyes betrayed worry. "Stronger than I would believe if I weren't hearing it." He adjusted the lamp slightly, ensuring warmth enveloped the tiny body. "But he needs constant heat and nourishment. He shouldn't be alive. And yet, he is." Grace leaned forward. "Will he make it?" Matthew took a moment before answering, looking from the pup to her with a softness that surprised them both. "I don't know," he admitted. "But as long as he keeps fighting, we will fight with him." Grace nodded, swallowing her fear. The pup's tiny paw curled toward her finger, as though recognizing her voice, her warmth, her promise. A fragile connection, yet one strong enough to steady her heart. "He chose you tonight," Matthew added gently. "Sometimes life knows where it needs to land." Grace brushed a fingertip softly over the pup's back. "Then I will take care of him," she whispered. "Whatever it takes." The tiny heartbeat fluttered beneath her touch, stubborn, determined. And in that warmth, Grace felt the first spark of something she had not dared believe in for years. Hope. The red glow of the heating lamp washed over the tiny body on the exam table, casting long shadows across the quiet clinic. Grace Walker stood close, refusing to blink too long for fear that one missed second might be the moment the fragile heartbeat beneath that soft fur finally faltered. Dr. Matthew Lewis worked swiftly but cautiously, preparing a microdropper filled with a formula designed for newborn pups. His large hands, strong yet gentle, moved with the careful precision earned through saving countless small lives. But nothing had ever been this small. As he positioned the dropper near the puppy's mouth, the pup opened it just slightly, tongue flicking weakly, trying with all its might to accept the gift of survival. "There you go," Matthew murmured in a voice that blended hope and command. "Come on, stay with us." By his side, Julia Carter held her breath, her wide green eyes full of worry as she watched every slight movement. She set a hand on Grace's shoulder to comfort her, though Grace didn't even realize she was trembling until the girl's touch steadied her. Grace swallowed, her voice barely audible. "Is he taking enough?" "A little is more than nothing," Matthew answered, his tone measured but his jaw tense. The pup swallowed again, then again, and the smallest squeak escaped, a protest too tiny to show anything but determination. Grace felt her own heartbeat synchronizing with the delicate rhythm before her. Love was forming faster than she could comprehend. The clinic door chimed suddenly, startling all three. Snow blew inward as Officer Daniel Brooks stepped inside. He was in his mid-50s, tall and broad-shouldered beneath his police jacket. Time had carved deep lines around his eyes, and streaks of gray cut through his short, dark hair. His presence was firm, yet not unkind. Someone shaped by the burden of protecting a small town where large tragedies rarely happened, though he always feared they might. Daniel's uniform boots thudded against the floor as he approached. "Everything all right? I saw the lights still on. Thought I'd check in." Julia quickly explained what had happened. Her words rushed with emotion. Daniel leaned over the table, eyes narrowing as he tried to understand what he was looking at. "That's a dog?" "A German shepherd," Matthew confirmed. "A miracle of one." Daniel blinked in disbelief, then whistled softly. "He's no bigger than a walnut." He scratched at his short beard, eyes softening with a surprisingly tender concern. "Where on earth did he come from?" "The Christmas tree in the square," Grace answered quietly. Daniel looked to her then, and his expression gentled when he noticed the exhaustion in her eyes and something like fear beneath it. He knew the town's people well, especially those who lived alone. He'd checked on Grace more than once after Thomas had passed, always under the guise of friendly patrol. Seeing her, now, standing over a life that so clearly needed her as much as she needed it, made his role feel suddenly much larger. "I'll look into it," he promised. "Make sure no one tossed a litter out there." A hint of anger crept into his tone at the thought, but Matthew shook his head slightly. "I don't think this is a case of cruelty," he said, puzzling aloud. "There were no other pups, no mother. It's as if—" He didn't finish, because even he couldn't say the strange truth aloud. As if the puppy had fallen from the tree as a gift from the heavens. Grace reached out and stroked the tiny creature's back with the lightest feather touch. The puppy responded to her presence again, its frail paw stretching toward her. That single movement melted the last layer of fear inside her heart. All that remained was devotion. Matthew exhaled, shoulders relaxing just slightly. He's improving, but he still needs constant warmth and feeding every hour or two. He turned to Grace with a question written in his eyes before speaking it aloud. "Do you think you're able to care for him tonight? It will be a lot. No sleep, constant attention." "Yes," she replied instantly, surprising even herself with the strength in her voice. Julia smiled, wiping her eyes. "He's already chosen her," she whispered. Daniel nodded firmly. "I can swing by in the morning. Check how you're both doing." Grace's gaze remained fixed on the tiny miracle before her. She felt something awaken inside, an emotion she hadn't dared feel in many winters. A purpose. Julia carefully patted a small box with towels warmed under the lamp, then helped Grace tuck the pup gently against her chest again. Matthew instructed her on feeding schedules, warmth, and signs to watch for. She listened to every word like a soldier receiving orders in wartime. When Grace was ready, Daniel held the door open. The cold night air rushed in, but Grace shielded the pup instinctively, hands forming a cocoon around the only warmth that mattered. Snowflakes drifted downward like blessings from above. The pup's heartbeat fluttered against her heart. Soft but undeniable. "Let's go home," Grace whispered to him. And as she took her step into the snowy street, she no longer walked like someone fragile and alone. Tonight, she carried a life that had entrusted its entire world into her shaking hands. A life that, against all reason, had already begun to save her. Snow whispered against the windows of Grace Walker's small cottage as she stepped inside, carefully closing the door behind her to keep the bitter wind out. The familiar scent of lavender and old books lingered in the air, a comforting contrast to the fear twisting in her chest. Her home was tidy, modest, filled with gentle reminders of the life she once shared with her late husband. Framed photos of youthful smiles, a rocking chair carved by his hands, and a wall of cross-stitched verses about love and faith. Tonight, All these silent objects felt like witnesses to something extraordinary. Grace hurried to the small living room, lowering herself into her rocking chair. With trembling hands, she unbuttoned her coat and lifted the tiny German shepherd nestled inside. The pup was still no larger than her thumb, but his breathing seemed ever so slightly more stable after the dropper feed at the clinic. Under the soft lamplight, she studied him more closely. His fur, though thin, glistened like soft charcoal threads. His ears were still folded flat, barely defined, and his paws, impossibly small, curled with a will to keep fighting. Grace's heart clenched with equal parts fear and awe. "You're such a little fighter," she whispered, voice quivering. "Such a brave miracle." She reached for the heating pad already warming beneath a folded wool scarf. Carefully, she laid the puppy onto the soft surface and placed her hand gently above his tiny form to hold the warmth in. He let out a faint sigh, gratitude in its smallest form. As Grace watched over him, a memory stirred. The moment years ago when her husband Thomas had brought home a stray kitten to cheer her after a difficult winter. The kitten hadn't survived the night, and she remembered how Thomas had held her as she cried, whispering that some souls were too precious for this world. Now, decades later, she found herself holding another fragile life. But this time she refused to let despair win. "Not tonight," she murmured. "Not ever, if I can help it." The clock ticked softly past midnight. The instructions from Dr. Matthew replayed in her mind. Feed every 2 hours, maintain warmth, monitor breathing, never leave him alone for too long. Grace leaned forward, observing every rise and fall of his tiny chest. Her eyes burned with exhaustion, but whenever they closed for more than a few seconds, panic jolted her awake again. Just when a wave of fatigue threatened to drag her down, there was a gentle knock at the door. Grace startled. It was far too late for visitors. She wrapped the scarf around the pup and held him close as she shuffled to the door. Peeking out through the curtain, she saw Margaret Hill, the elderly woman who lived across the street. Margaret was about the same age as Grace, but taller, with a proud posture and hair styled into a perfectly curled silver bob. Her bright red wool coat was dusted with snow, and her cheeks flushed from the cold. Margaret had a reputation around town for being outspoken and strong-willed, a widow who refused to let loneliness dull her spirit. She often checked in on neighbors, claiming she didn't like sitting idle while the world moved on. Grace opened the door cautiously, surprised. "Margaret, is everything all right?" "I should be asking you that," Margaret replied, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Her sharp blue eyes scanned the room before landing on the bundle in Grace's arms. "Daniel told me about your Christmas miracle." Grace blinked, startled by how fast news traveled in Willow Springs. "It's true," she admitted, carefully opening the scarf so Margaret could see. The pup stirred, stretching one miniature paw. Margaret covered her mouth with one gloved hand, eyes softening despite her usual stern demeanor. "Well, he's tiny as a snowflake." Grace nodded. "But he's fighting. He's fighting so hard." Margaret set down the thermos and grocery bag she had brought along. "I figured you might need some help. Tea to keep you awake," she said, patting the thermos, "and soup for energy. And I brought an old baby blanket, known to encourage growing." She smiled, half playful, half hopeful. Warm gratitude swelled in Grace's chest. She hadn't realized how desperately she needed someone beside her until Margaret arrived. They settled together near the warmth of the heating lamp. Grace fed the puppy again, drop by careful drop. Margaret watched closely, occasionally whispering encouragement like a coach at a championship game. Hours passed. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows as if the night itself wanted to test their determination. Grace was eventually forced to lean back, exhaustion nearly overtaking her. Margaret reached out, strong fingers steady on Grace's shoulder. "Rest your eyes," she urged. "I'll watch him for a bit." Grace hesitated, fear flaring again, but trust overruled it. Her eyelids fell shut, and she drifted into a shallow sleep, still clutching the side of the heating pad where the pup lay. When she woke again, dawn's gray light filtered into the room. The clock showed 6:12 a.m. Somehow the long night had passed. Her heart lurched as she looked immediately to the pup. He was still there, breathing, and when he blinked open his tiny eyes, just a sliver, it felt like the most triumphant sunrise Grace had ever witnessed. "Good morning," she whispered, tears filling her eyes. "Welcome to another day." And for the first time in years, a Christmas morning didn't feel empty. It felt like the beginning of something worth waking up for. Morning sunlight crept gently across the living room floor, bouncing off old picture frames and warming the faded floral rug beneath Grace Walker's feet. She blinked away the remnants of exhaustion, startled to find she had fallen asleep, sitting upright in her rocking chair. But the moment her senses fully returned, her heart leaped into her throat. She looked immediately to the heating pad beneath the wool scarf. The tiny German Shepherd pup lay there, barely larger than her thumb, nose twitching softly, chest fluttering with small, determined breaths. His eyes, a pair of barely open glimmers, caught the warm morning light as though trying to understand the new day that awaited him. "You're still here," Grace whispered, voice cracking with pure relief. "You really made it through the night." Margaret Hill, her neighbor, stretched stiffly beside her in another chair, hair slightly messy from falling asleep mid-vigil. Her silver curls stuck out in unusual directions, but her spirit remained unfazed. She rubbed her eyes and leaned in closer to examine the pup. "Look at him," she said, her tone mixed with amusement and awe. "A warrior wrapped in fur." Grace laughed, an unsteady but joyful sound she hadn't heard from herself in a long time. "A warrior needs a name," she said thoughtfully. Margaret tilted her head. "Well, he's small like a spark, a little flame refusing to go out." Grace nodded. A spark, a flame, a light. Her husband once told her that hope was the brightest light a human heart could hold, even stronger than fear. A memory, soft and bittersweet, pressed against her chest. "Sonny," she said finally, "because he's bringing light back into my life." The name felt right. The puppy lifted his tiny head, as if claiming his name with silent pride. "Sonny it is," Margaret affirmed, smiling warmly. Grace's phone buzzed unexpectedly on the coffee table, startling both women. Caller ID flashed an image of her daughter, Anna Parker, a woman in her mid-40s with sleek chestnut hair, always dressed professionally and carrying the air of someone constantly in motion. Anna lived across the country in Seattle, working long hours as a real estate consultant. She was caring and thoughtful, yet often distant, not by intention, but by a life pulled in too many directions. Grace hesitated before answering. "Anna, Merry Christmas," she greeted, steadying her voice. "Merry Christmas, Mom," Anna replied, her tone warm but distracted. The faint hum of city life echoed in the background. I'm sorry I didn't call last night. Things got a little busy. It's all right, Grace said gently, though a familiar ache tugged at her chest. How are you? Anna exhaled. I'm okay. Just checking in. Are you spending today with anyone? I worry about you alone on the holidays. Grace glanced at Sunny, then at Margaret, who gave a conspiratorial wink. I'm not alone, she replied, softly. I have company, a very special one. There was a pause. Oh? A neighbor? No, Grace answered with a quiet smile. Someone new. I'll tell you all about him later. After ending the call, Grace lifted Sunny into her palm, feeling his warmth and the tiny heartbeat that seemed to be growing stronger with each passing hour. She gently fed him a few drops of warm formula. He drank greedily, messy but determined. Heavens, look at that appetite, Margaret said. He'll be asking for steak soon. Grace giggled again, another reminder that this morning was unlike any she had known in years. The front door rattled with a soft knock. Margaret rose quickly, stretching her stiff back before opening it. Officer Daniel Brooks stood outside, jacket still flecked with snow from the early patrol. His steadfast posture softened at the sight of the women inside. Just checking in, like I promised, he said, stepping inside and removing his hat. His features, strong jawline, tired eyes, were eased by a hopeful smile. How's the little soldier? Grace proudly held up Sunny. Daniel leaned closer, eyebrows lifting in amazement. Well, would you look at that? Eyes open already? A fighter, Margaret said. He wants to see what kind of trouble he's gotten himself into. Daniel chuckled, rubbing a thumb thoughtfully over his wedding band. The gesture held a quiet melancholy. He rarely spoke of his wife who had passed years prior. The pain behind his guarded tone made it clear he had never fully recovered. Watching Grace with Sunny sparked something gentle in him, the feeling that maybe life still offered unexpected grace. I brought some supplies, Daniel said, setting a small bag on the table. Inside were tiny syringes for feeding, gauze, warming pads, and a miniature plush toy, just small enough not to overwhelm Sunny. Grace blinked in disbelief. You didn't have to. Couldn't help myself, Daniel replied shyly. Besides, he's a resident of Willow Springs now. That makes him my responsibility, too. Sunny's tiny paw pressed against Grace's finger, as if agreeing wholeheartedly. Everyone fell still for a moment, united by the miracle nestled warmly in Grace's hands. A creature so impossibly small, yet powerful enough to knit three lonely hearts together. Grace inhaled deeply, her soul filling with something she hadn't allowed herself to believe in for too long. Purpose. This morning was proof that sometimes the smallest miracles shine the brightest. And as Sunny curled into her palm and drifted to sleep, she thanked God quietly for a Christmas gift that had given her more hope than any prayer ever had. 2 days had passed since Christmas morning, and Willow Springs was settling back into its usual winter rhythm. Snowplows carved neat lines down quiet streets. Chimneys puffed thin trails of white, and the golden ornaments on the town tree swayed gently in the lingering wind. But inside Grace Walker's home, time seemed to move differently, measured not by clocks or calendars, but by every heartbeat of the tiny German shepherd named Sunny. Grace sat in her rocking chair, spooning warm milk into the miniature dropper. The wrinkles around her eyes looked softer these days, no longer carved by loneliness, but warmed by purpose. Sunny rested on her knees atop his wool blanket, eyes opened wider now, blinking curiously at every motion. His ears were starting to unfold, tiny triangles twitching whenever she spoke, as though he had already memorized the melody of her voice. "You're hungry again, aren't you?" Grace teased gently. "That's a good boy. Good boys fight." Sonny licked the dropper eagerly, his movements clumsy but full of determination. His fur had grown fluffier, a subtle change but enough to fill Grace with pride. Every wobble of his tiny legs was a declaration. "I am alive. I am not giving up." A knock sounded at the door, firm but not alarming. Grace placed Sonny carefully back onto his warmed blanket and stood, smoothing her cardigan as she opened the door. On the porch stood Julia Carter, still in her blue scrubs despite the cold. Her auburn hair was tucked under a knitted hat this time, and her cheeks were flushed pink. She held a small bag in her hands, labeled with the Animal Clinic's logo. "Morning, Mrs. Walker," Julia said brightly, stepping inside. "Dr. Lewis asked me to bring these supplements, and to check if you needed anything." There was a gentleness in Julia's eyes that reminded Grace of her younger self, a heart too big for the world, always hoping, always helping. Grace smiled warmly. "Thank you, dear. Sonny will be glad to see you." Julia crouched beside the chair, leaning close to Sonny. "Hello, little miracle," she whispered. Sonny responded by lifting his head and wobbling one tiny step forward, his first attempt to walk toward another human. Both women gasped softly. "You walked," Julia breathed, hand hovering excitedly above him. "You actually walked!" Grace pressed a trembling hand to her chest. Her heart felt too full, like joy had suddenly grown bigger than her ribs could contain. "He's growing faster than anyone expected." Julia nodded. "Some animals, they decide their own fate, and sometimes it's bigger than anything we can predict." Grace blinked back a tear. "Thank you for helping him, and for helping me." Julia placed a hand gently on Grace's arm. "You've done more than any of us. He's alive because you refused to stop caring." Before Grace could respond, the door opened again, this time without a knock. "Delivery!" a cheerful voice called. Ben Miller, the town's mailman, stepped into view. He was in his early 30s, tall with sandy brown hair and a broad grin that seemed permanently glued to his face. His postal uniform was layered under a thick winter vest, and snowflakes clung to his eyelashes. Ben was known for chatting too much on his routes, but every resident adored his kindness. "Sorry for barging in," he said quickly, raising a hand in apology. "Mrs. Walker, I didn't want to leave this package outside. It looked important." He placed a small cardboard box on the table, then noticed Sonny. "Whoa, that the miracle puppy everyone's talking about?" His grin widened. "He's the size of a cupcake." Julia laughed softly, and Grace nodded proudly. "This is Sonny." Ben's eyes sparkled with genuine delight. "Well, little fella, you've become the celebrity of Willow Springs." Grace opened the package while they watched. Inside were tiny sweaters, handmade, knitted delicately with yarn softer than silk. A note rested on top. "For the puppy who gave Willow Springs its Christmas miracle." From the knitting circle, Grace's heart fluttered. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted one of the sweaters, no bigger than a tea bag. The kindness of others wrapped itself around her like a blanket. She looked at Sonny and imagined him wearing it, strong and brave, surviving not just because of her, but because of a whole town. Julia helped her dress Sonny in the tiny green sweater. It fit perfectly over his small body. Sonny let out a soft squeak, as if announcing his new fashion proudly. Then he tried to take another step. His legs wobbled, but he moved forward again. One step, then another, and then he stumbled, rolling gently onto his side like a clumsy acrobat. Julia giggled, clapping once. Ben cheered softly. Grace covered her mouth, overwhelmed with emotion. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living. As Sonny climbed his way back to his feet, Grace pressed her hand to her heart. For the first time since losing Thomas, the future didn't look empty. It looked bright, glowing with a tiny spark named Sonny. There, in a home once too quiet, laughter replaced silence. Hope replaced fear. And the miracle at the base of the Christmas tree became a miracle learning how to walk. A week after Sonny first blinked against the glow of Christmas morning, Willow Springs awoke to a crisp January dawn. Pale sunlight stretched across rooftops heavy with snow, and smoke curled into the sky like gentle prayers from chimney tops. For most townspeople, it was an ordinary winter day. But inside Grace Walker's cottage, life felt nothing short of extraordinary. Grace sat near the sofa, where a soft fleece blanket lay spread across the floor like a tiny playground. Sonny, still no larger than a thumb, wrapped in his miniature green sweater, stood on his wobbly legs, sniffing the boundary of his woolen world. His ears now perked slightly, proud little triangles declaring, "I am here." "Slowly, sweetheart," Grace murmured, her voice full of admiration and nerves. Sonny squeaked, took 3 determined steps forward, then proudly attempted a 4th, only to tumble sideways into Grace's slipper. Grace laughed softly, scooping him into her palm. "You're going to run this house one day, aren't you?" Sonny butted his nose gently into her thumb, and though the gesture was tiny, it filled Grace's heart so fully she feared it might burst. A knock on the door interrupted their moment. Grace stood, adjusting her cardigan as she opened it. Officer Daniel Brooks stood outside, smiling his polite, reserved smile. Snow clung to his sturdy boots and his dark police jacket. His usually serious hazel eyes softened the moment he saw Sonny perched in her hand. "Morning," he greeted. "Thought I'd check in again. Couldn't help myself." Grace stepped aside to welcome him in. Daniel crouched down near Sonny's blanket. His large hand hovered close as if afraid his touch would be too much pressure. "Look at you, fighter," he said, with a softness rarely used by men who had seen too much loss. Grace watched Daniel. The careful way he carried his strength, the way he fought not to show the ache still haunting him since losing his wife. She realized Sonny wasn't only healing her, but others around her as well. Daniel cleared his throat and stood up. "I, wanted to ask something," he said, rubbing the back of his neck with a shy awkwardness that didn't fit a police officer's uniform. Grace raised a brow. "What is it?" "The department wants to share Sonny's story," he explained. "Hope, miracles, community. The town needs something good to talk about." He hesitated as though afraid his words might overwhelm her. "Only if you're comfortable, of course." Grace's heart fluttered with nervous pride. She glanced at Sonny. "Well, he is a miracle." Daniel's relief was immediate. "Great. How about we start small? A visit to the clinic today. A little checkup, and maybe Julia can get a picture or two for the town's bulletin board." Grace bit her lip, excitement and fear competing inside her. Sonny chirped, as if answering for her. "We accept," she decided. Daniel smiled, tipping his hat before leaving on the rest of his patrol. Grace hurried to dress Sonny again, securing his green sweater gently around his tiny body. "Your first outing since you fell into my life," she whispered. "Let's show them what hope looks like." The walk from Grace's cottage to the clinic took only 10 minutes, but to her it felt like stepping onto a stage. People peered curiously from windows or paused while shoveling driveways. News traveled fast in Willow Springs, and Sonny had become the town's favorite mystery. At the clinic, Dr. Matthew Lewis greeted them at the door. Tall, with dark stubble shadowing his jaw, and tired eyes full of wonder, he looked more awake than he had in weeks. "Good to see you again," he said warmly. "Both of you." Inside, Julia Carter zipped around excitedly, arranging a few small blankets on the exam table. Her auburn ponytail bounced with each quick movement. "We're ready," she beamed. Grace carefully set Sonny down, bracing herself for another flood of emotion as the pup stood under the warm lamp like a tiny soldier reporting for duty. Matthew examined Sonny with delicate precision. "His muscle tone is improving," he noted, genuine surprise lifting his brows. "And his weight is up by nearly 20%. Grace nearly cried hearing those numbers. "He's doing all the work," she said, wiping her eyes. Julia chimed in, grinning proudly. "He's determined. A real little hero." "A hero needs fans," a man's voice called from the entrance. Ben Miller, the cheerful mailman, stepped inside, this time joined by a woman Grace had never met. The woman, Heather Collins, appeared to be in her late 30s, with shoulder-length blonde hair and warm brown skin. She wore a long knitted dress and carried a camera around her neck. "Sorry to intrude," Heather said with a shy but enthusiastic smile. "Ben told me everything. I work for the Willow Springs Community Journal." She lifted her camera slightly. "May I take a photo or two? Sonny's story could bring joy to a lot of people." Grace looked at Sonny, now standing tall as a thumb can be, and nodded. Heather approached slowly, lying on her stomach to get eye level with the pup. Sonny tilted his head, blinking curiously into the lens. The click of the camera captured a moment that could only be described as pure innocence triumphing over an impossible start. "Beautiful," Heather whispered, tears thickening her voice. And then something unexpected happened. Sonny stepped forward, 2 confident steps, and placed his tiny paw on Grace's finger. Heather gasped, camera trembling. Matthew stood stunned. Julia covered her mouth. Ben let out a cheer. Grace felt the warmth rush through her veins like light awakening a darkened house. It was a moment not simply witnessed, but believed. A miracle unfolding in real time, in the form of a tiny shepherd learning how to stand tall. Sonny squeaked proudly, as if claiming his new role. A symbol, a reminder. Hope still lived here. And in that room, surrounded by newfound friends, Grace realized something extraordinary. She was no longer just saving Sonny. He was saving the whole town. Winter returned to Willow Springs in a gentle hush, wrapping the town in soft blankets of snow as if the world itself wished to stay quiet just a little longer. The Christmas lights had faded from the season, but warm ribbons of hope remained, especially inside Grace Walker's heart. Weeks had passed since the night the tiny German shepherd had fallen into her life like a blessing from a silent sky. And now the once fragile newborn, no bigger than a thumb, had grown into a lively, bright-eyed companion who could walk, explore, and even try to bark, though it sounded more like a tiny hiccup than a mighty claim. Sonny's fur had thickened into a soft mix of brown and sable gray, still small enough to fit in Grace's palm, but now with a shine that promised life rather than fear. His ears perked sharply whenever Grace spoke, and he often stood tall on his little legs as if to defend her from the world, despite being smaller than a teacup. Grace sat by her window, rocking slowly in her chair as Sunny patrolled the blanket-covered coffee table with tiny, proud strides. She hummed while she sewed a new sweater sized exactly for him, a dark blue one with a single white star stitched over the heart. A star of hope, a star of the night he was found. The silence danced with warmth and comfort. There had been a time when silence meant loneliness, but not anymore. A knock sounded at the door, followed quickly by another, more eager one. Grace smiled. She recognized that kind of rhythm, someone excited beyond patience. She opened the door to find Heather Collins, the local journalist, bundled in a dark red coat and a thick gray scarf. Her friendly brown eyes sparkled behind her camera, which hung from her neck like a beloved partner. Heather's personality was soft yet bright, someone who believed in the good of people and dedicated her life to sharing stories that reminded the world of kindness. "Mrs. Walker," Heather exclaimed, "the article went live this morning. People are talking about Sunny everywhere." Behind her came Ben Miller, cheerful as always, his sandy hair poking out from beneath his postal cap. He carried a stack of mail and packages, far more than usual. "You're officially famous," Ben grinned. Or, well, he is. Grace blinked as the realization settled in. "Sunny?" "Word has spread far past our town," Heather explained, excitement bubbling in her voice. "People are calling him the Christmas miracle shepherd. They're sending letters, hundreds of them. Well wishes, gifts, donations to the clinic in his name. Hope is spreading." She placed a small parcel into Grace's hands. "This one came from California. A woman who just needed a reminder that good things still happen." Grace's fingers trembled as she opened a card resting atop the parcel. "Thank you for reminding me that miracles still exist. Martha L." Tears glimmered in Grace's eyes. Joyful, light tears that washed away years of quiet sorrow. Sunny squeaked from his tabletop perch, demanding attention, earning chuckles from the visitors. "Look at him," Ben laughed. "He knows he's the star." Another knock came, and this time it was Officer Daniel Brooks, his uniform dusted with snowfall, his hazel eyes warmer than the fireplace he stood near. He gave a polite nod to the room before turning to Grace. "Good afternoon," he said gently. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Of course not," Grace replied. "Come in. Sunny likes visitors." Daniel stepped inside, removing his hat. Though tall and strong, there was always a gentleness in the way he moved around Grace's home, a silent respect for the warmth it held. Sunny immediately hurried in a wobbly trot, to him and bumped a tiny paw against Daniel's boot. "A fierce protector," Daniel joked, an affectionate smile tugging at his lips. Grace noticed that smile. She noticed the slight brightness in his eyes that had once carried too much loneliness. Everyone gathered around Sunny, showering him with affection. And in that moment, Grace realized the little pup wasn't only her miracle. He was a spark that had reignited hearts across the town. Heather pulled out her notepad. "The mayor has requested to meet Sunny," she announced. "She'd like to present something special to both of you in the town square this evening. It's not every day a miracle brings a whole town together." Grace's breath caught. "Me? But I haven't been to a public gathering since..." she trailed off. Since before Thomas passed. Since life had become too heavy to hold alongside others. Daniel placed a reassuring hand on her arm. "You won't be alone," he said. "We'll be there." Sonny let out a defiant squeak as though insisting he would lead the way. Grace looked from face to face. Heather's excitement, Ben's encouragement, Daniel's steady support, and felt something warm take root in her soul. Confidence. Evening arrived swiftly, draping Willow Springs in soft blue twilight. The town square glowed once more with the towering evergreen tree at its center, now laced in silver lights that shimmered like falling stars. People gathered in coats and scarves, smiling eagerly when Grace arrived. Sonny, dressed in his new star-stitched sweater, stood proudly in her cupped hand, tail flickering like a tiny flag. Mayor Linda Cooper, a round woman with rosy cheeks and silver-rimmed glasses, greeted them warmly. She had a voice that boomed like a choir, bold and full of cheer, especially when celebrating her town's achievements. "Citizens of Willow Springs," she called, raising her gloved hands. "Tonight, we honor a reminder that miracles do not need to be large to change our world." Applause rang out like bells. Grace felt her heart swelling. The mayor knelt toward Sonny. "For renewing our hope and for reminding us to care for even the smallest among us, present to you the first Heart of Hope Award." She handed a tiny medal, crafted just small enough, to Grace, who pinned it gently to Sonny's sweater. The crowd cheered. Sonny puffed his chest proudly, giving the tiniest bark the world had ever heard. And everyone laughed, not at him, but because joy needed somewhere to go. Grace looked up at the shining tree, remembering the night she knelt beneath it, asking God silently for a reason to keep walking forward. And now, she held that reason in her palms. Daniel moved beside her, his voice low so only she could hear. "You saved him," he said. Grace shook her head, tears warm against winter air. "No," she answered softly. "He saved me first." Snow began to fall, not harshly, but like blessings descending from a heaven that had listened. Sonny nuzzled into Grace's hand, safe and loved and home. For the first time in years, Grace felt completely alive, surrounded by friends who had become family, holding hope that had taken the form of a tiny shepherd. The night didn't feel cold anymore, and Grace understood that miracles didn't simply arrive. Miracles stayed. Sometimes, the smallest miracles arrive in the quietest moments, not through lightning in the sky, but through a fragile heartbeat resting in our hands. Sonny may be tiny, but God used him to shine a great light, reminding us that He never forgets those who feel alone, that hope can fall into our lives when we least expect it, even behind a ribbon on a Christmas tree. And just like Grace found new purpose in caring for this little soul, we too can discover blessings hiding in the ordinary. A smile from a stranger, a phone call from someone we love, a new day we've been gifted to live. If this story touched your heart today, please share it with someone who might be needing a reminder. God is still writing miracles every single day. Tell us in the comments, what's a small miracle you've experienced in your life? And if you believe God watches over every creature, big or small, join our family by subscribing, leave a like, and share Sonny's story to spread faith and love across the world. May God bless you with comfort, companionship, and a light that never fades. Amen.